America, and welcome to this morning's huddle, brought to you by Going on Offense. I'm Darrell Moon, and I'll be your host today. We have a wonderful guest panelist with us today that I'm excited to speak with, and we would encourage you to join the conversation as we participate today. Please feel free to bring in your comments and your thoughts. We're holding these huddles every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in an effort to support those struggling, to brainstorm strategies to help, to promote resources, and to engage collaboration. Now to introduce today's guest. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend Dr. Danny McLane, owner of ADIO Chiropractic Clinic. I'm going to invite Dr. McLane to take 4 or 5 minutes to introduce himself and to share a comment or two. But before I do, I want to invite all of you to participate in today's conversation. Would love to hear from you and include you in the conversation. So just raise your hand on your control panel and I'll turn on your microphone and you can be a part of the conversation. Or if you just want to send in a comment or a question, feel free to again on the control panel. Dr. McLane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, thank you very much, Darrell. I appreciate it. And first off, I want to say thank you very much for having me as part of your morning huddles. I think it's a huge opportunity for me to share what I know with people. Obviously, I've dedicated my life to helping people in the service for health. I mean, you and I have a lot of goals and a lot of directives that are very aligned, so I was really excited about jumping on this. So, yes, I'm a chiropractor. I have a degree in behavioral science. That's my background. So I really like the neurobehavioral aspect of healthcare. I've actually been invited to national conferences to speak on what happens inside the brain when somebody sets a goal, how that impacts how they think, how they process, what areas of the brain light up, and how that involves with other things. Today, we're talking about how to live in harmony with your brain, because I think that right now a lot of people are under a significant amount of stress. And what's interesting, and I'm sure that you see this too, is there's a lot of little habits that either are good habits that break down or bad habits that start to form because people start to seek different ways to handle really an inappropriate level of stress, right? So I'm really excited that we get to talk about that today. I have a bunch of really interesting topics. Maybe we'll get to all of them. Maybe we'll get to some of them, have a part two. I don't know, but I'm really glad to be here. So in my practice, we are multidisciplinary. I work on people both locally and remotely. Everything from, throughout my study of the brain, it ties into everything and it ties everything together. So I've spent my career mapping what things the brain processes, what flows into that. For example, like a nutrient deficiency. I was studying the work of Dr. Reardon. He was in Wichita, Kansas, at a place he created called the Bright Spot. And what he found out is there are certain nutrients that will actually predispose people to manic depressive episodes or rage episodes or other psychological disorders, very deep medical psychological disorders. And he was able to fix that specifically with nutrients. And so that part of it, looking at the inflow, and of course, what happens when there are specific breakdowns in the brain, whether it's through social interactions, whether it's through traumatic brain injury, whether it's through just normal functions of everyday life. So by getting that whole map together, that links a lot of different areas together. But we like to keep it really, really simple as much as possible. And I know that I jumped in on a whole bunch of really big neuro topics. I'm going to keep it real pedestrian today. I lecture to doctors and to lay folk all the time. So I'll make sure that we keep it really pedestrian so that way everybody has access to something beneficial from the talk. They can walk away doing something today that they can apply in their everyday life. So with that being said, I'm really excited to jump in.
Thank you. Well, let's start off with, how's this pandemic affecting you personally and professionally? Tell me a little bit about your own personal experience.
Well, personally, it was really interesting. My wife is a speech pathologist, so she's been working from home, which means I get to be, a teacher to my 2 little girls, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they're brilliant, which is fantastic. It makes my job a whole lot easier, but it requires me to use a skill set that I didn't really have well developed. So I'm not a terribly organized person. I'm like the big idea guy, and not like the manager. That's why I married my manager. Like, my wife is amazing. She's really detailed, really organized, really scheduled. It's actually quite a miracle that I am in the right place at the right time doing the right thing this morning, that took a lot of planning and preparing. So, so my own personal struggle is, that daily routine, making sure that, when you get a bunch of people together in the same place doing the same thing, it's much easier than if you have two people in the same place doing different things, especially kids. So that's been tough from a personal standpoint. But obviously we're making it through, and I get to spend more time with them and really see what they're doing in schoolwork rather than just get a report card or a note back from the teacher. From a professional standpoint, I'm used to seeing a lot of people. I'm used to being in the mix and really having something big to contribute to a lot of people's lives every single day, which obviously is a big win for me. It's a big feel good for me. And to be honest, I've been doing maybe 25% of what I'd normally do. So not having that consistent presence with people, really seeing everybody light up, and that's one of the things that I miss really bad about this. I could imagine that that's a common thing across the board. I talk to people, and everybody says that what they do is there to help people, mostly, whether it's an engineer making skyscrapers or an auto mechanic fixing cars. We're all in this together, and when we get separated or put apart, you can see it. It really does put a lot of strain on people.
It does. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this fascination in the brain and the study of neurology, call it whatever you want, but behavior, and obviously you're a chiropractor, but tell us a little bit about your fascination for the brain and what got you into the behavioral science.
Sure. Well, that comes from my own personal background. When I was 7, I was in 3rd grade. They sent me for testing to figure out, excuse me, why I wasn't doing so well. Like, nobody fails 3rd grade, and I really wasn't doing doing well at it. So they wanted to see what was wrong. And after a very long day of testing, they said my intellect calibrated grade level should have been 8th grade 3/4 of the way through the year. So plenty smart to handle the work that was being thrown at me, but wasn't really engaged, didn't really have if only I could find the motivation, right? So they gave me a couple of labels, ADD, ADHD. There was, they also said I had obstinate defiant disorder, to which I said, no, I don't. So but from that day forward, I noticed I had a lot of self-awareness that said, when I'm really dialed in, when I find something that fascinates me, when I find something that captivates my attention, I'll spend, days, weeks, months, even a lifetime pursuing it. If I find something that doesn't interest me, wild horses couldn't drag me. You know what I mean? Like, I
Right.
absolutely could not do it. That's happened to me with, like, history, for example, or algebra. I have no interest in algebra. Now, you start talking about, like, the interworkings of the brain, we're going to be here all day. This is how it goes. So I saw that in myself, and I'm a lifelong learner. I've always really been interested, especially I went through massage therapy school because that was a really hands-on technique, and I'm very tactile. I like to build things very hands-on. But I went through massage therapy school, and the first thing that we did for the first 2 weeks, we didn't get into any of the anatomy and physiology. What we did is we learned how to learn. So we did an intelligence type test. We looked at different learning styles, which I thought was really interesting. And then I just kept taking classes, and I got to a point where I was ready to teach, but I needed to have a certain level of credits to teach massage therapy. So I took a college class, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to go to school and do homework. I could show up, memorize everything, and take a few tests. And I was like, I can do this. This is easy. All I have to do is memorize everything. So I got really good scores, really good grades. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, well, I have all these college credits. And there's some really interesting things that I want to study that get deeper into the brain. Kind of like what they said, Albert Einstein had to go back to school to learn math so he could describe the universe. I was like, I could go to school to be a doctor. I can go to school to be a doctor to learn about how to describe what I'm noticing in the brain. And that's really what I did. I picked chiropractic because it's functional neurology. I think that neuroscience is a really, really broad and diverse area. I got a degree in applied behavioral science, and because that's how society kind of runs. It's something I was studying anyway. I was like, wait a second, you guys give me a college credit for learning about people? Yes, let's do that. And I figured if I'm going to be working with people, I may as well understand them. So that's sort of where it started and kind of how the progression went. I've also done postdoctorate training in acupuncture because there's a lot of physiology that plays into functional brain stuff, functional brain wiring and nerve function. I also have postdoctorate training in addictionology and compulsive behaviors. That's one of those higher level classes that you have to be a doctor to get into. So I'm very fortunate to have had a lot of really great people sort of along my path to help nurture and culture development in this area. So because neurology sits squarely in the center of everything in your life. So people talk about hormones. That's, changes in brain state change hormonal states, but it's also bidirectional. So if you have a hormonal disruption, like people with thyroid issues, they usually experience low energy. Well, energy could be like a brain state, or it could be a body state. People with functional malnourishment, people that maybe they eat okay, but they have a lot of stress, so they burn out all their minerals. Well, now their adrenal glands don't function, and it'll keep them at that nice, rigorous, happy energy level. And then that's where we start to see people get into bad behavior. So hang on just one second. There we go. So as far as that's concerned, a lot of times when I'm also a certified hypnosis instructor for the National Guild, because one of the things that I learned a long time ago is talking with people is very, very helpful, but that's a resource that's available to a lot of people. And I know that you guys do a great job coaching and keeping people on a consistent, creating rituals around healthy habits, behaviors, mindsets. One of the things that I have as a personal hang up is I'm not terribly patient. I don't have it in me to coach somebody through the same problem over the course of several months. And that people that can do that, that is amazing. That is they're a blessing to this earth. I wanted a way to get it done faster. Especially with things like, smoking cessation, weight loss, those kind of things. So I went that route, and I think that, as long as you have a pretty full tool belt and whatever options you have and you can get the job done, it works. But one of the things that I've found is that most of the time when people come to me for this really powerful brain state change, what it comes down to is there's actually some pretty simple things that they're not doing in the regular everyday life. That really could promote overall health and then put them back in the driver's seat.
So talk about those.
Anyway.
Let's talk about the kinds of basics that when a patient comes to you that you start with. What are the foundations of principles that you teach them to address those issues, particularly in light of today's pandemic and the stresses that people are feeling?
Absolutely. One of the things that I always recommend first and foremost is sleep. Not just sleep, but circadian hygiene, if you want to call it that. Like, what does your day look like? How are you using your time? That's usually the question I ask. Like, how well do you sleep? How are you using your time? Because what I found is there's 24 hours in a day. If you break that up into 3 different 8-hour chunks, there's 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, which in this society, maybe since the pandemic hit, people are a little bit more on point with that, but I doubt it. A lot of the level of work that we are required to do to be a normal functioning part of everyday society requires a significant amount of structure. And when you take that structure away, now people that are working from home, and I've talked to clients that, I've still been working through this and helping a good number of people, and almost unanimously across the board, the one thing that everybody says is that it takes them twice as much time to do half as much work. So that means all of the other 8 hours, the recreation, the sleep, the rest time, what I like to call hammock time, where people have that brain-free time or downtime, time that people would normally spend on hobbies or investing in personal growth, gets eaten up by inefficiency. So whether there was a technology issue, they couldn't get onto their Zoom call, whether it was they had to schedule at a different time, which then normally it would start to disrupt the routine. And that's one of the other things that we talk about is routines and habits. I'll touch back on that in just a minute. So routines or habits, or even rituals. So what I found is that a lot of people, because they are currently working around a different set of structures, and maybe sure they've saved 30 minutes or 40 minutes on their commute in the morning, or maybe they don't have to get their pants pressed and ironed because nobody's wearing pants on Zoom calls these days. Maybe that saved them some time. But in the long run, the mental stress and strain of just having all of their life disrupted, especially because we're missing that social contact, whether it's going out for a walk with a friend at lunch, or having your Thursday night bowling league, or hanging out with the guys or whatever the case may be. A lot of those rituals that would help for people to decompress, they're not getting the trigger, that cue in their mind that says, okay, we're done with work, now we're going to go to home. They're starting to have a lot of bleed over, where I've talked to plenty of people where they don't know when to disconnect. Typically there's that sort of ceremonial piece where they walk out of the office and say, you know what, it'll be there when I come back. Well, what happens if you're lucky enough to have a home office? Fantastic. What happens if that's your living room or your kitchen table? And I mean, you and I are very fortunate that we have a significant amount of support and good people around us. And the place that we are at in our company means I don't know about you, but I don't really have anybody barking at me telling me that I didn't do a good job, right? So I'm the boss. If I do anything wrong, I get yelled at by me, which I'm very kind. I think that's important. But that's not true for everybody else. I've talked to several people that they have metrics and standards of performance that they're held to, and when they don't meet those, they have very real consequences for that, whether it's promotional opportunities or penalties for dollars, or they get extra work, or they just lose face, or whatever the case may be. There's a lot of real life penalties for the work that they're doing or not doing, and that happens in an environment where they're supposed to be safe, where they're supposed to be able to escape all of that, and now everything's just sort of mashed into the same container. Yeah, I had one lady, she's like, you know what, I figured out I can use my phone charger to plug my iPad in, so when I can actually just, what she did is she realized that her morning ritual was so important to her that she would literally get in her car and then drive to the office and then just work from her car in the office parking lot for her shift and then drive home. She realized that she was being impolite to her children, that she was really not present and focused with work. She's like, when I'm at home, I have this complete transition. She's like, I transition my clothes, my hair, my snacks, and music, like everything is different, because she does have a pretty high stress job. And I've seen that pattern, and she's just a really good shining example of that, but I've seen that pattern or variance on that theme quite a bit. There's a lot of psychosocial factors that play into that workspace, especially now that there's people that are getting real world penalties, or maybe even it's not their boss, maybe it's themselves. Maybe they have a really high expectation of their performance. I've seen so many people. One of the ladies I was working with, she literally said that her district just released a whole 2-hour webinar about being good enough or feeling good enough. She works in the therapeutic space, and right now a lot of the therapists feel like they're not doing as good of a job as they could. And the whole message behind that was just like, you know what, these aren't normal times. Don't expect normal results. Just be easy on yourself. To which she responded, I have standards. I'm not lowering my standards. I was like, you might have missed the point. Let's go back through that again. So
what you're saying, let me just kind of say back what I'm hearing you say, and that is that there's a real turn on, turn off in our brain as we move through different functions throughout the day, those 8 different connections. And that a lot of people are struggling right now because the natural transitions from work to home, or that hammock time, is just not happening. And so in the case of one of your patients, it was so severe that she recognized she needed to actually leave, go to work in the parking lot as though she's at work, and then come home because she needed that transition. I think that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
And what you're saying is that's all part of our brain. That's just the way our brain works.
Absolutely. And the way that the brain works is you really should have that time of high focal intensity where you're on. This is where you're figuring out problems, whether it's math or story problems, or somebody brings to you a complicated case you have to dig through. It depends on what line of work you're in, but everybody knows when they really have to be dialed in. That should only be 8 hours a day. And they've done studies on this in the workplace where if people go 10, 12, 16-hour shifts, they start to lose some of the clarity, the crispness. They start to miss out on some of the details. Even if it's something so basic as data entry errors, those start to rise very sharply after that 8-hour mark. And that's part of the reason why we have labor laws that say, if you work 8 hours, you have to have 2 15-minute breaks and a 30-minute break and those kind of things. That's why people don't work 16 hours. a day anymore. They don't work 6 days a week anymore. And so if you're looking at that from, you're typing in a customer's order, okay, maybe they get the wrong product. Well, what happens if that customer's order is a prescription medication? Or what happens if that data entry error is linked to a technical spec for some kind of architectural drawing or engineering application where, those load stresses make a big difference. So, and obviously different areas, different walks of life will have different consequences for mistakes, but mistakes are always bad. So, but that is hardwired into your brain. So you can have a high intensity focus for about 8 hours. Obviously, every couple of hours, it's good to get up, walk around, get a drink of water, just to remind your brain that everything's okay. Give yourself a sense of refreshment. Typically, I recommend once an hour that people take a 3-minute brain break. You can get up, march in place for a few minutes. One of my clients so affectionately referred to that to his spill and fill time. So, he would go to the bathroom and drink some water. So I just thought it was kind of clever the way that he said it. So just giving yourself that chance, because what happens, a lot of people get really, really engrossed in something for a long time, 2, 3, 4 hours in. And then the next thing they know, they feel like they're like, man, I'm so tired, I'm fatigued. And, they feel like they need to, that's when they start to go for, that's where bad habits really start, is where you overextend yourself. So like, I just want to touch on that real quick for the consequence of not living according to the biological rhythms. So biological rhythms say that you should sleep 8 hours. I've seen a lot of success gurus, a lot of people that are pushing for entrepreneurs to work, every hour they're awake. If you can't work, then sleep. If you're done sleeping, then get up and work, but not a lot of time in between. I've also seen, like, Arnold Schwarzenegger at one point mentioned, he's like, the way I got ahead of everybody else is I slept 6 hours when everybody else was sleeping 8. That means I got 2 more hours of production. But that's not necessarily a great way to do it. You hit a point of diminishing marginal returns, and that's a concept from economics that says the more, the hurrier you go, the behinder you get. That phrase actually comes directly out of traditional Chinese medicine. They say the hurrier you go, the behinder you get. Or Abraham Lincoln was most famously quoted as saying, haste makes waste. Being methodical and calculated, with that 8 hours, really allows you to have maximum impact when you're working, and then you really should disconnect, downtime, recharge, and then come back refreshed. One of the other doctors I was listening to basically said that if you wanted to have a major breakthrough in your work or the line of work that you do, that you need to have a minimum of 7 days of complete disconnect from it. It turns out that when you're putting information into the brain, you're not really processing what's there. It's sort of like eating. You eat a bunch of food, and then it sits in your stomach and digests for a while, and then over the course of the next 24 hours, it goes through this process. Well, that biological process not only exists in your digestive system, but it also exists in your mind. That's why we use the word like digest for thought. We have to think about it. Let me digest it. Let me sleep on that, right? That's a strategy that works for a lot of people, because in order for you to fully engage in the information that you have to disconnect from the incoming stream of information. The number of problems I've solved for people, whether it's like really weird skin rashes that won't go away, gas, bloating, digestive problems, chronic headaches, chronic joint pain, immune system issues, all of these big issues that are sort of nebulous, right? It's not a disease, it's a dysfunction. There's no snake to cut the head off of. It's not a bacteria that you have to poison in the system. It's the system itself. It's a normal system not functioning normally. That's a dysfunction. The number of times dysfunctional issues come from living outside of the normal biological rhythms is probably close to 75%, maybe even further up if we look at it as a predisposing factor for other illnesses, whether it's mental illness, immunological problems, or just physical aches and pains. And that's one of the things in my clinic that we do. We break everything up into one of the 3 parts of the triangle of health. So you have physical, structural, muscles, bones, joints, that kind of thing. Mental, emotional, that's stress and mental taxation. A lot of people don't get taxation. We'll talk about that in a second. I'll drop down a note. Now you got me started. This is gonna be awesome. So, and then of course the electrical chemical piece, which that's chemistry. A lot of times comes down to what you eat or don't eat. And the electrical stuff is all of your biological normal rhythm. So like if you don't sleep well, then that's going to be an issue. Or the shift workers, they've shown that shift workers don't sleep at the right time, right? They're up at night and they sleep during the day. They are 25% more likely to have a heart attack than somebody who's not a shift worker.
Really? Even
Yeah,
though they may set the pattern to where it becomes a regular part of their life? Really
absolutely.
interesting.
And they've done the study, they've done the work on those people because they wanted to see if there was genuinely a danger to productivity. And it turns out that when we're talking about just systems in general, and I'm very much a systems guy. I like to think of the big high level stuff. I actually wrote when I was like 18 a systemic analysis theory that got submitted, and one of my friends saw it and he took it to Mensa and they invited me to come talk about it. It was really interesting. But basically, systemic analysis theory, everything can be fit into one of two systems or three systems. But I like to look at it from an economic standpoint versus a biological standpoint. Economic systems basically say you have an economy of scale. It is much cheaper to produce 100 cars per car than it is to produce one car, right? So if you at your home wanted to build a car, it would cost you a lot more money than if you were to have a factory to build 5,000 cars, and then, per car it would cost less.
Right.
Now, we look at biological systems and it's the opposite. It is far easier for you to grow 2 tomato plants than it is for you to grow 200, right? So from an agricultural standpoint, the more similar things you want to produce in the same space, the harder it is to do. The more steps we have to take. Where they've actually done the study between like natural farming versus agricultural business or agribiz, where they've shown that if you rotate through the land properly, the cows eat grass and then they leave their feces, which then turns back into fertilizer. That's a part of a normal cycle. Well, if you break that cycle apart, now what you have is one good solution. Now is 2 separate problems. Where if you have cows concentrated on a feedlot, that feces becomes so concentrated it's toxic, and then you have plants that are out in the field that are starving, that aren't getting the nutrients they need that would be readily available. Now, that is all to say that you have these diametrically opposed systems that don't agree with each other. So production and economy is all driven on economy of scales. It's all mechanistic, but biologically we don't run that way. So they wanted the workplace people wanted to look to see if there was a detriment to putting people into a mechanistic system that would then, if that would affect them at all. And what they did is they did a long-term study where people that work third shift, maybe 10 years or more, some people their whole life. And what they did is they found that those people are more predisposed to every kind of inflammatory condition you can have.
Really?
And it turns out, that's fascinating to me. And it turns out that if you look at the biology between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., now that's a very important window. Because I have some people that are like, oh yeah, I sleep plenty. Well, when do you go to bed? Now we're talking about circadian biology. Buckle up, it's about to get fun. So you have people that are like, oh yeah, I usually go to bed around, do you go to bed after 9? That's the question I ask. There's a very specific question, and it's very specific to 9 o'clock. Why? Because 9 o'clock is when you're supposed to wind down, right? But I will guarantee you, anybody that does not get in bed by 9, usually their natural bedtime falls somewhere around 11 o'clock, maybe plus or minus a few minutes, right? Because what happens is if you're not asleep by 9, or you're not winding down by 9, you get an adrenaline surge, you get a second wind, and then it carries you for 2 hours because circadian biology runs in blocks of 2. Really interesting stuff, and oddly enough, it runs on the odd hours. So 9, 11, 1, 3, 5, 7, yada, yada, yada. All right. Because I'm not a math guy. But so most people don't start settling in until about 9:30, 10 o'clock. And if there's food, if there's snacks, if there's wine, alcohol, anything else that kind of falls into that late night territory, does
Ice
change
cream.
our biology. Oh, buddy. See, that's not part of my normal habit, and it's not until I start talking about that it comes to my awareness. But the number of times people are like, oh, I just have a little bit of ice cream every single night. I'm like, they're coming to me for weight loss or allergies. And allergies and digestion are very, very closely tied to the biological cycle. Because if you don't have your body living in rhythm, and this is where we go back to everybody got thrown out of work. Maybe they're not working right now, or maybe they were asked to work from home. Well, now if you don't have your normal cycles, maybe you don't start your day at the same time, maybe you don't finish your day at the same time, or maybe grocery shopping now takes an extra hour and a half so that you don't come home and have dinner at the same time, so then everything gets pushed later. So you get this change in your habits. And what that does is that throws off all your normal rhythms. Well, if you're not winding down by 9, you get a second wave of adrenaline, which then pushes you to 11. Well, if your normal time is you're up from 9 to 11, so like you normally go to bed at 11, but everything got pushed back an hour today, you're up till you instead then go to, you're watching people watch shows, or they're doing their thing, and that's an hour. So instead of going to bed at 11, they're going to bed at 12. Well, they got their second wind. So I guess that'd be third wind technically, but that won't shut down until about 1 a.m. So even if they go to bed at midnight, now they're missing 2 hours of sleep. There we go. That's on the video. So they're missing 2 hours of sleep. Compounded over a period of time, maybe for a little while they can handle it. In isolation, it's actually a little easier to handle it, because if you need to disconnect or shut down in between, that's fine. They've actually shown that napping in the middle of the day actually helps to boost your overall energy levels. The problem is it throws off the rhythm. People are creatures of habit. So if they stay up too late, they miss 2 hours of sleep, and then the next day they're a little tired. But compounding over a period of time, and of course I'm going to go back to Albert Einstein on that, who said that compounding interest is the eighth wonder of the world. I look at that from a biological standpoint that says if you have something that is generally adding to your health over time, you're going to get healthier and healthier over time, right? Versus if you have something that's diminishing your health gradually and even incrementally, just tiny fraction of amount, like even 0.5%, compounded over a period of time, that builds up. And we know from buildup that there's eventually a breakdown.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that's really, sorry, go ahead.
So let's get this into a real practical. In fact, I want to encourage anybody that's on the call, if you've got questions for Dr. Danny, please post those or raise your hand. But I would like to know, obviously you don't encourage all of your patients to go get in the car and go work in the parking lot of their office, but maybe give some other examples of how we can build these routines in an unusual environment so we bring that harmony back into our brain. What are some things, in terms of that transition from home to work, from work to home, and during work, what are some things, when we take those breaks, what are some suggestions to keep the harmony in place?
Absolutely. One of the best things for that is, as much as nobody likes discipline, routine is your brain's favorite way to live. So if you can think about what life was like before this shift, and try as best you can. Now, granted, grace is super important. Don't beat yourself up for, nobody's ever punished themselves well, right? So a little extra support, a little bit extra grace, a little extra help is always going to be beneficial during this time. But the number one thing that your brain lives on is patterns, habits, and routines. That we are what we consistently do. I think that was Aristotle, right? So making sure that even if you don't have to be up until 10 o'clock to be on a call, or 6 o'clock, or whatever the case may be, get up and do your normal routine. Now, that is to say that if your commute is 45 minutes and now that chunk of your day is gone, maybe instead of going for a drive, maybe you get up and go for a walk, right? So we can start to replace some of these required components with beneficial components. And maybe if it's a rainy day, instead of going for a walk, you do a meditation or a stretch, or do 15 or 20 or 30 minutes of deep breathing. There's so many other little things that you can do that you can put in beneficial components. I like to think about it as like Legos, right? If you have a bunch of these interchangeable parts, what parts are you taking out? What parts can you put back in? So if you're going to take out a red block, put in a blue block, and now your structure looks generally the same. So I would strongly encourage everybody to take a moment to go through and write down what the rest of their life was like before everything happened, and try and create a structure that looks very similar to that. And because that's going to give you the least amount of extra mental taxation. I mentioned taxation a little bit earlier. Taxation is the amount of effort required to think about something. So you could necessarily not have any emotional response to it, but just trying to apply your own structure to your life means you have to have all these extra steps, all these extra pieces in place. So if ahead of time you think about it, you plan the work the plan, don't think and work at the same time. Don't try to do it all on the fly. That's going to cause a lot of extra steps, a lot of extra mental taxation. It's going to require a lot of brain power to do those things.
Drain the brain.
So, absolutely. And they've shown that willpower is an exhaustible resource, which is fascinating. They've shown that if you use willpower, it's one of the things we talk about with my weight loss clients, because we do that for everybody. So if you have something in your local environment that you have to consistently refute, eventually you're going to wear out and you're going to eat the ice cream or the cookie that you shouldn't have eaten. So if you create an environment that is harmonious and helpful for you, you won't have to think on the fly. So, and for some people, a change of location absolutely is the best thing. I've had it where people, or it's enough for them just to have a morning routine. They get up, they still get dressed in work attire, they still put on their makeup or their jewelry or their suit or whatever. And maybe they're not wearing shoes in the house, but 80% of a routine still reminds your brain where you're at. It gives you that sort of that orientation, and that'll allow you to be in the proper space, proper place mentally for when you sit down to work. Same thing with your evening routine. If you would get home at 5 o'clock every single day, and then you have a nightly routine based on that 5 o'clock time frame, stick to that as close as possible. If somebody wants to put a call later on in the day because right now we're not only dealing with our stuff, we're dealing with everybody else's stuff that falls in, like everybody's raking their leaves in everybody else's yard, right? So it's really important. And right now, if you've not typically been good at this, get good at saying no, like flat out. Because right now the expectation is that you're going to be available all the time because what else are you going to do? Right. Absolutely refute that. Like kick that out, say no as nicely as you can, but don't leave any room for doubt, because what's going to happen is there's this bleed through, not only in your life, but everybody else's life too. So by keeping a regular scheduled habit routine, keeping that anchor point, it's going to keep you from having a lot of that, like what you said, brain drain, just from trying to think about things all the time. So if you plan the work the plan, but don't think and work at the same time. This is one of the things that we use for a lot of my clients, especially the ones that are super busy. The more structure you have, the more you need to plan ahead. A stitch in time saves 9, right? If you study I look at a lot of the success coaching, because they've figured out a way to maximize human performance. Brian Tracy, another one of my favorite authors, he basically says that if you, for every minute you spend in planning, it saves you 3 to 10 minutes in performance. So if you have everything planned out ahead of time, even if it takes you 4 or 5 hours, you're going to yield that back in the first week alone. By getting your structure and discipline down. It seems like a tedious task. It seems almost unnecessary. It is a goal-directed activity instead of a goal activity. So goal activity is the thing that gets the work done. Goal-directed activity is the planning and preparation to actually do those things.
That's
so
fascinating.
What's that? Sorry?
It's fascinating.
Yo, absolutely.
I do have a question because I don't want to run out of time. I'd love to get your input on this. Everybody during the day, when their mind is focused on something, it gets tired. And too often people pick up the 5-hour energy drink and say, give me that bump in energy so I can finish this process. But talk a little bit about the value of maybe breaking away, doing some meditation, engage the relaxation response, a more healthy approach to getting the brain back up and working versus the caffeine or the 5-hour energy drink to keep it going.
Sure. So one of the things that I've seen happen consistently is it's called the coffee wine cycle. We alluded to it a little bit earlier, where people stay up a little bit too late. Their habits, their patterns, their routines are off, so they end up being up too late. Then when they get up in the morning, they need that little kick. So sometimes, according to circadian biology, it's either between 8 and 9 a.m., which is usually where you get your first cortisol spike, or between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where everybody gets that sort of 3 o'clock slump. Hang on just 1 second. Sorry. Anyway, they get that little 2 o'clock slump, and they'll go for some kind of caffeine. I always caution people about that. Your body is always best internally regulated. So if you start using things from the outside to change your energy levels, first, always look to your habits, sleep, discipline, exercise. What works better than 5-hour energy? A tall glass of water and a 10-minute walk.
Yeah.
So, and if you don't have enough energy to walk, you should try it anyway. Just throwing that out there. Even if it's pacing up and down your hallway, fine. Music has been shown to do that, whether it's exciting music or relaxing music. So that's another one of those tricks that we like to bring into that. On my YouTube channel, I have a 5-minute power relaxation hypnosis recording. It takes 5 minutes. We just talk you down, get you relaxed, bring you back up. What's interesting is hypnosis, meditation, if done properly, guided meditation, guided relaxation, actually brings you to the state that you seek when you sleep. So out of 3 hours of sleep, you get about 20 minutes of this deep brain cycle, right? And that's where your brain sort of cleans itself out. Most people they're not physically tired and they're not out of energy. What they are is their brain's too loaded up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they can't do any more work, it's that they can't carry any more load. They have to set something down before they pick something else back up.
Right.
So in that 3 hour window of sleep, you get 20 minutes of this deep brain cycle where your brain actually cleans itself out. So that being the case, if you can take 10 minutes or 20 minutes and do that relaxation, whether it's, self-guided or out, externally guided, in hypnosis, you go straight down to that deep brain cycle and you stay there for the whole time. So if you do a 1 hour, maybe 1 hour is impractical, maybe you do 20 minutes. And of that 20 minutes, you are in that state for 15 minutes. That is the equivalent of 2.5 hours of sleep. That's going to do way better for you than a 5 hour energy, especially if you do that like around 2:30, 3 o'clock. They've shown that the addition of caffeine at the wrong time actually blunts your body's own natural energy cycle. So it actually, long term, it shuts it down. Plus, caffeine has this really wicked effect. Caffeine looks a lot like the byproduct of what your body uses for energy, right? So if you're having a fire, it'd be like throwing more ash into the fire pit, right? And your body looks at that and says, "Whoa, this is too much of this. We have to dial this back."
Right.
So what ends up happening is if you apply caffeine, then you're actually getting less energy the next day. And then that's not to say that you're going to even sleep well that night, because a lot of people are caffeine sensitive. Caffeine also blocks the melatonin receptors in your brain, so then you don't get that deep cleaning, that downtime, that cycle down. So it's a very dangerous thing to do long term for health, and it's very insidious, which I think is why it's very dangerous, because a lot of people think it's pretty normal. I don't know how many times if you've stopped at your local gas station, there's advertisements for every kind of caffeine you could possibly imagine. You walk in the grocery store, they have caffeine enhanced cookies now, which is very dangerous. But I think that you absolutely hit it right on the head when you said that there are disciplines and habits, there are actions that you can take rather than try to use something from the outside. And that discipline brings your brain to a point where it gets used to being in charge of itself. So as you develop those good, healthy habits, that good energy hygiene, that circadian healthcare, you are going to really keep yourself in check. And it also will tell you when you're doing too much. There will be times where what you have are natural consequences to an unnatural environment. And for that, you should have a red flag. You should have something that says, you know what? All things considered, this really is too much for a person to tolerate. You shouldn't do all of this. You need to rework some things in your life. Maybe that's a long-term goal or a medium-term goal, but you should have some kind of warning system. A lot of the medications that people take, whether they're over-the-counter or they're prescribed, are specifically designed to reduce those signals. And those signals are imperative. By getting that proper signaling, it tells you that, yeah, you're living outside of what you can tolerate. So by making sure that you apply the walk, an 8-ounce glass of water, even if it's just marching in place, that cross motor activity, moving the opposite hand and foot, rewires the part of your brain that turns your brain on for creative problem solving. So if you get stuck, don't just sit there and grind away at it. So many people, they become over-focused or under-focused. Mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm. Take a break, walk. And walking specifically, and when I say take a break, I don't mean like jump on Facebook or go check social media, or that's not a break. That's just doing other work. Disconnect and then come back refreshed. That's going to be huge for you. So I think
Danny, we're getting close to the end, but I'd love to give you 4 or 5 minutes. If there's anything as we're wrapping up that you wanted to bring up today that we haven't had a chance to talk about, take 4 or 5 minutes and do that, so we capture some of the good meat topics that you wanted to share today.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the fact that we're kind of just in the process, and you've had a lot of really good questions. I appreciate that. Like I said, this is my area of expertise. This is my passion. This is my obsession. So we could literally do this for the rest of the day. I
too. I'm very passionate. You and I could talk for days.
Oh man, it's so good. So, well, we talked about. There's a couple other things that I had on my list, but we could always do those another time. But one of the things I absolutely wanted to touch on is very, very important. It's sort of a framing statement for everything we've talked about today, which I think is probably a good thing to conclude with. So we talked about the build-up. You get these little micro additions or subtractions to your health over a period of time. One of the biggest follies that I see people have is they assume that things change in a linear progression, like 1 + 1 = 2, + 1 = 3, + 1 = 4. That's not how it goes. All natural systems are subject to natural laws. One of the natural laws is threshold, right? Threshold means water can be 100 degrees and be liquid, or it could be 35 degrees and be liquid. But if you go a few degrees colder, it turns from liquid to solid. And it happens instantaneously when you cross the threshold from 33 degrees to 32 degrees. This is Fahrenheit. Celsius is at 0, it turns to ice. So from 1 degree to 0 degrees Celsius, it turns to ice. So, but that's how all things happen. If you notice, that's how bridges collapse. That's how buildings fall down. That's how fire starts. You know, cellulose or wood pulp burns at 451 degrees. At 450, it's just really, really hot wood. At 451, it's a fire. That same natural thing happens in people. So people, they go along and they're like, oh, I can tell I'm not as healthy as I was before. I think I'll change it eventually. I'll get there. I have time. You don't. Your body does not start to express symptoms until you've lost about 80%.
Really?
So by the time you have one symptom, you're already negotiating the last 20% of what's going on with that. They've shown that to be true with histology studies, where they look at organs. So liver, 80%. You will not show any signs of liver problems until you've lost 80% of your liver. Same thing with your kidneys. That's why end-stage renal disease goes so quickly. With spleen, it's 90%. A person could be 85% diabetic and not know it. So that sugary thing that you're treating yourself to every night, that actually causes, or even toast, right? So toast boosts your blood sugar fast enough, high enough, and long enough to actually cause damage, physical damage to the part of your body that creates insulin. So that's where we start to get into diet. And now that's a whole other conversation, and I'd love to indulge everybody in that. But if you have micro habits that cause you to lose a little bit, you won't hardly notice. So it's really important for people to be present and aware of that. If you want expert help, I'm always available. I know that you guys have a great program for that, especially when it comes to the stress and lifestyle stuff. You guys do a fantastic job with that. But I always encourage people to really, really get a fine-tooth comb. And if you're not sure if you're doing it right or doing it wrong, make sure you pick the right expert. There's plenty of people that don't understand this concept, and they will push people until they break. They're like, oh, well, that's just what happens to people. No, it's not. It's because they're cashing in their biological futures. They let everything build up, and then when the breakdown happens, they're surprised. They're like, well, that came out of nowhere. No, it didn't. They just didn't. Yeah, that's always a fun conversation. Like, well, why didn't my other doctors know that? I don't know. Do your doctors read 10 to 20 articles every day? Like, are they obsessed with this? No? Okay, well, maybe find a better doctor then. And I think there's great doctors, and I think that everybody should find them. They say that some unemployment is good because it encourages people to increase their skill set and rejoin the workforce at a higher level. So I think that if we were to really be honest with ourselves, everybody that is listening to this, watching along, they probably have at least one or two things that they can do today, whether that's drink more water, go to bed on time, get up, stretch, work, move. Excuse me. I think that there's at least one or two things that everybody could do to help push that balance back in their favor. So.
Great concluding remark. Thank you very much. This has been exciting.
Absolutely.
Again, you and I could do this for days. But in conclusion, I want to mention that we won't be holding a huddle this Monday because it is Memorial Day. Our guest panelist for Wednesday will be on May 27th, will be Nancy Spangler. Nancy is the president of Spangler Associates, and she'll be speaking about shared responsibility for resilience, how individuals and organizations must understand the risks and opportunities together. Following this huddle, we'll be sending out a survey. Please take some time, share with us your thoughts, give us some feedback. If you've got topics or ideas for a future huddle, please share those with us. Or if you know of people that would be a good guest panelist, or if you'd like to be a guest panelist, please share those with us by communicating through the goingonoffense.com contact us form. So the website is goingonoffense.com, and we have a contact form. Please use that. We want to thank today's participants, and especially Dr. McLane, for your contribution, your talks, and again, your insights to the brain and how the brain works and how we can make the brain work better for us. We want to thank all the organizations who have gotten behind this movement. There's some wonderful offers, some wonderful resources, ideas, suggestions, even free resources and services that companies are offering. Please check those out on the help page on the website. And we are recording this. We'll be posting this later today. I've got a short little video to show you at the end on having daily affirmations, which are great for the brain. And so we're going to sign off now. Again, say goodbye to Dr. Danny. Thank you. And again, we hold these every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I'll conclude with this short little video.